All right. Well, hello everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here and get a chance to talk about design and user experience, which is not something that most developers and companies were focusing on just a few years ago. So it's really good to see so many people here and the industry as a whole caring a lot more about building user-centric products where the design process obviously plays a major role. And that's a topic I want to discuss today. But first, let me quickly introduce myself. So my name is Benjamin. I work as a designer at Stripe. For those of you who don't know about Stripe, we are an online payments company. And the most important part, of course, is that we care an awful lot about design. I'm also part of the CSS working group, where I get a chance to work with these amazing people, even though I don't look particularly excited on that photo. Anyway, given the audience, I assume most of you know about the CSS working group, and actually some of you also are in the CSS working group, including your fantastic MC for tomorrow. But for those of you who don't know about it, the CSS working group belongs to the W3C, and it is responsible for the CSS specifications, which involves drafting new CSS features, fixing bugs and compat issues, writing text, etc. So, given my experience in the CSS working group, I am now confident I truly understand the meaning of CSS, which I'm sure stands for charming, subtle surprises. How convenient. That's exactly what I wanted to discuss today. So this talk is about building delightful user interfaces and making design central to the development process of your products. And we're going to see how things like motion design and a user-centric front-end development process can significantly improve the perception of your brand and products and greatly increase trust, user satisfaction, and engagement. Now, most people in this room are probably convinced that it's absolutely crucial to polish the user interface. But that's not the case for everyone, right? And although it might seem obvious for all of us that design deeply contributes to building better products, we are often in a position where we need to convince other people that caring and investing in a design and ultimately in the end user experience is not just a gimmick and can, in fact, very well be a strong marketing and competitive advantage. For example, the Design Index study measured the return on investment in design over a decade from companies traded on the Financial Times stock exchange. And the conclusion was crystal clear. The design-centric companies were doing much better than the other ones, and the share price of those companies actually outperformed the other ones by more than 200%. So the relationship between the effective use of design and long-term business success is undeniable. So we can probably just simplify that complicated chart like this. That scientific chart hopefully proves design is important. Now, joking aside, the software landscape has evolved dramatically in the past few years, and it's not enough anymore to just solve a problem. You have to create a product your customers love using. Things like user retention, satisfaction, engagement, etc., are absolutely central to the soaring of your long-term business. And design is now a major differentiator in ensuring product success in a crowded global market. And in fact, I would go as far as saying that just caring about design is not even enough anymore. You have to go the extra mile. It's now almost a baseline expectation for new apps to provide rich and fast interfaces. Now, what does it mean to go the extra mile? How do you surprise and delight your customers? What kind of details are we talking about? Well, there are several angles we can take from technical tricks to, say, improve performance in very measurable ways, to design details aimed at simply making your customer smile. So we're going to analyze a few examples and try to understand the rationale behind these charming, subtle surprises, why and how we made them, and basically what it means to go the extra mile. So the first thing I want to show that sort of exemplifies what it means to go the extra mile is this component for providing feedback. So usually, these things are super annoying, and you have to fill out a huge form full of comments, etc. But this one here is a neat example of how small interactions can really improve the experience and make things just, nicer to use. So in order to provide your feedback, you just click on the appropriate emoji, and you get this nice little animation that highlights the selected feedback. Now, since this component needed to be mobile-friendly as well, it made a lot of sense to be able to drag your selection where you want it. And as you do so, you can see the expression tweening from face to face. I personally find that super cute. Anyway, so that's a good example of how clever interactions and motion design can really bring some fun to your interface while actually enhancing the user experience. Now, I would like to dig a bit more into the topic of motion design, and we're going to see how, we're going to take the landing page of Stripe Connect as a base example. So there are a bunch of things on this page we're going to discuss, and we're going to see how animations help building a great user experience. But the first part I want to focus on is arguably the least important one, and yet I think those details say a lot about your brand and your philosophy. So let's have a closer look at the icons below the header, illustrating the features in the 3 columns. So instead of having traditional static icons, all of them benefit from subtle animations that really bring these icons to life. The first one is using request animation frame to animate the SVG. The second one is using the new Web Animations API, and the third one is using WebGL to create this proper 3D rotating effect. So as we can see, we now have a lot of options to animate things easily on the web. And it's important to start considering animations as a new tool in your design tool belt, because they can really leverage your metaphors and convey much more than what a static image could. For example, the third icon on the right, illustrating the paragraph about Stripe Connect being truly global. We were initially not too sure about the rotation angle to show on that little planet icon, because by definition, if you only show some countries on a static icon, well, you are not really global. So instead of choosing what to draw, we just chose to animate the globe. So the rotating animation is not just there because it's cool, although it is pretty cool, but it actually solves a real design issue, which is in this case to make it look truly global. So that's just a tiny example of how animations often help in telling a better story and conveying more information while actually, keeping things nice and simple. So another example of how animations help conveying more information is with the play video button in the header. So we have those 3 images behind the button, which are still images extracted from the video you're about to play in order to give you a sneak peek of what's coming. And by the way, we actually redrew these 3 images in vector so we could export them in SVG and have them inline straight into the HTML. So there's no HTTP request to get them loaded, and you have them displayed in front of you in the header immediately. That's, by the way, another way to delight your customers, but on a more technical level. And of course, it takes more time to do that than basically taking 3 screenshots from the video. But at the end of the day, you should never trade off your personal convenience for the end-user experience. Anyway, so when you click on the play video button, instead of having the content shifting around and just a harsh context switch as you often see on the web, the 3 images from the video morph together and expand into the video they actually come from. So you get something that looks arguably pretty nice, but the most important part is that you are clearly connecting states. That is by far the most important attribute of animations. They link actions to consequences in a logical and understandable way. So instead of having 2 completely separate states like A and B, there's now a clear relationship between them. The actions triggered by a user initiate a progress in the interface, that becomes expected and explicit, and the flow of interactions becomes manifest. So that should be the primary reason to bring animations to your interface. They help connecting the dots and setting up a better, more reliable mental model. Another example from the same page where animations help understanding the flow is with this routing payments chart. So this chart illustrates the various payment flows that Stripe Connect enables so that customers can identify the appropriate one for their business model. And as you browse the different options, the changes between them are animated, so you can clearly notice what's different between them. And animations literally connect the dots here. And if we keep scrolling, we have yet another example of how animations help understanding a flow. In this case, to illustrate Connect's onboarding flow. So instead of explaining it or showing parts of the process with static screenshots, we just show the actual thing by having this animation that starts playing automatically as you scroll. And by the way, this is an actual animation, not a video, because animations made in code, in this case with the Web Animations API, provide a much better experience. They're much smaller than videos. The whole thing here with images, scripts, etc., is just about 5 kilobytes. They are resolution independent. They can easily be responsive, etc. So just like with the images for the video in the header, coding the animation is, again, definitely harder, but it's ultimately a matter of providing a better experience for your customers. And for the same reason, the phone itself is also made in code. And in fact, all the devices on the page, like this 3D laptop, and even the image on the screen of this laptop are made in code, again, for the same goal of making things light, fast, responsive, localizable, etc. So these were just a few examples of how animations help us understand what's going on and improve the user experience. And we also briefly saw how our technical choices can have a significant impact on this very user experience. Now, I would like to discuss that topic a little bit more and see how code will change the perspective of your brand from your customers. I strongly believe code, and specifically front-end development, is really part of the design process, and it's how we can deliver better, faster, and more enjoyable interfaces. And I would like to start with the latter and show a few examples that are just about delight and that really create these charming, subtle surprises we mentioned earlier. And the first one I want to show is this Apple Pay landing page. There's a lovely SVG animation in the header, which again helps, telling the story and providing context. But the part I want to focus on is this little compass icon at the bottom of the screen. So we saw previously how animations can really bring icons to life, and this one goes a step further. If you visit the page on your phone and tilt the screen, well, the compass works as expected. So another example is this illustration on the Elements page. So Elements is a set of UI components that help you create your checkout flows and that give you a lot for free, like real-time validation, localization, etc. Because building really good payment forms is actually very hard. And if you want to do that properly, you have to do a lot by yourself. So Elements abstracts all this complexity and does a lot for you out of the box. And this is what this section on the screen is explaining. So the illustration is just about showing at a glance how much more you have to do by yourself if you are not using Elements to create your payment forms. But instead of having a gratuitous illustration or something completely abstract, we actually made it useful. You can select and copy-paste the illustration, and you get the actual code to implement it on your page. So this is an example of literally going the extra mile and delighting your audience by making something completely unexpected, yet fascinating and actually useful. And this approach, this mentality of truly polishing your products says a lot about the company as a whole and inspires confidence and trust in your brand, which proves to be a huge competitive advantage over time. The last example of how a development process centered on the user can greatly improve the experience is with our environment page. So we are a carbon neutral company, which, by the way, I'm really proud of, and we built this page to educate and encourage other companies to do the same. So we have a bunch of charts explaining and illustrating the challenge we're facing, and the charts are being drawn as you scroll to give you a better idea on the growth and how things are unfortunately accelerating. We then have more information on our emissions and then on the initiatives we are taking. And finally, some resources on the topic in case you want to learn more. But the part I want to focus on is this header image. So the problem is that this image is fairly heavy, despite the fact that it's well optimized and served as a WebP image when possible. But we didn't want to show nothing until it's loaded. So let's see what happens when the page loads on a slow 3D network. We can see a blurred version of the image being shown until the actual image is loaded. Now, it's not a crappy, poor resolution image being scaled up like crazy. It's actually a properly designed blur. And when the actual image is loaded, the blur sort of vanishes with a smooth animation. So if we look at what's happening behind the scenes, we actually have a clean, responsive SVG illustration of the image, which is then blurred with a filter. That's really cool, because we can control on the fly the level of details and the amount of blur we want. Or we can even just completely remove the blur and tweak the illustration straight from the DOM to change the art direction directly in the code. And since the code of that SVG illustration is inlined straight into the HTML markup, there's no HTTP request, which means there's no delay before you see the SVG illustration, which is the main benefit of that approach. And when the image is loaded, the final hero image just fades in over the illustration with a nice and smooth transition. And that SVG illustration is then removed from the DOM. So this is another example of how your front-end craftsmanship can really help improving the user experience for everyone. So we've seen how code can really be part of the design process and improve the end-user experience. But we can go a step further and literally use code as a design tool. So you've probably noticed that we use a similar pattern everywhere on our site, where we use these tilted stripes, as we obviously call them, as a graphical element that builds our identity across the pages. But designing those stripes is not an easy task, mostly because you're trying to create something a little bit random in terms of colors and positioning, but there are just so many possibilities to try that it's extremely time-consuming to explore a wide range of options. So, in order to fix that, we decided to build a small generator. The idea is that you just set up a few options that match the look and feel you want to have for your page, such as the background, the colors of the stripes that you can pick from our color palette, the style and size of the stripes, etc. And you just let the app generate a bunch of options for you. Now, in general, a design becomes truly interesting when you are able to bring just enough visual noise to it, and when you make just a few things messy. When everything is messy, it's obviously terrible. But when everything is perfectly clean and aligned on a very rigid structure, it's not very good either. The magic comes from a perfect mess. But it's very hard for us as designers to be messy on purpose, which is why tools like that are incredibly useful. You can explore a ton of options by just clicking a button and contemplate layout ideas you probably wouldn't have considered on your own. And when you're finally happy with the generated layout, you can switch to the Code tab and copy-paste the markup and CSS code to implement the exact same thing on your page, and possibly tweak some details to adjust the result to something that really fits your design. And then you can use this generated header to start designing your content properly by using this background as a starting point in your design process. So that was a specific example of how code can not only improve the end user experience, but also your own authoring process by providing a design tool perfectly suited to your needs. Now, my goal with all these examples was to get you excited about building user-centric products, not only because, honestly, it makes our jobs more fun and interesting, but because it has a real, tangible business value. Now, I personally failed if I didn't get you excited, but I also failed if I got you way too excited. My goal is to get you reasonably excited. The problem with animations and going the extra mile, etc., is that it's way too easy to start doing way too much, which is obviously counterproductive. Animations, for example, can make your products a lot more pleasant to use when used properly, but they can very quickly become overwhelming. So let's try to highlight a few best practices to make sure we are not going overboard. All right, so we'll have to be mindful about both the design and implementation. So I highlighted a few best practices for each. The development part will be a little bit more technical, but we have to embrace this topic because it contributes to a great user experience just as much as the design process. And in fact, I would go as far as saying it is actually part of the design process. Okay, so first let's start with the design and probably with the most important advice. You can animate, you can delight and go crazy, but make sure it's actually useful. Now, it doesn't mean you are not allowed to have a bunch of visual flourishes that are just meant to make your customer smile because, I would argue that making people happy is actually useful. But in general, resist the temptation to go YOLO on all the things. Animations serve a real goal, but when they're used for the wrong things, they might get in the way and slow down your interactions. And I'm sure you will agree that there's nothing worse than, say, hijacking the scroll just for the sake of animating something, for example. And to be clear, it's totally fine to trigger some animations based on the scroll position, but please never, ever interrupt my workflow. A good example of a scroll-based animation that doesn't get in the way is with the radar page. So one challenge designers frequently face at Stripe is that our products are often completely abstract, and there's nothing to really show. So we usually have to find metaphors to illustrate our pages. And honestly, I wish sometimes I was designing the next iPhone website instead, so I could just display a huge photo, write iPhone in black above it, and ship it. But we are not selling iPhones, so we have to find ways to explain our services. And in this case, this scroll-based animation really helps providing context. So we have this 3D rotating sphere composed by all the data points we analyze to fight fraud. And when you scroll to the next section, the different types of data get isolated to highlight the various sources we analyze to detect fraud. And then when you keep scrolling, we zoom into these data points and provide finer details about the features and the way we detect fraud. So that's a great example of how an animation can really help telling a story and how you don't have to do horrifying things like scroll hijacking to do interesting things. And to be clear, when animations get in your way, it's not just slightly irritating, it might have terrible consequences. For example, on iOS 11, Apple decided to add some animations on the keyboard of the calculator app, so that when you press a key, you have a subtle fade-in animation that highlights the key. Now, while it might seem completely fine at first sight, the problem was that the animation was blocking the touch events until the animation was complete. So if you were typing quickly, say 1 + 2 + 3, chances are you would get 24, which is not exactly right. So this is a telling example of how important it is to make sure animations never get in the way and never interrupt the workflow. So back to our best practices, and with the second point being about respecting user preferences. Again, by default, animations should always be subtle and look almost invisible. But even then, it might be too much for some people. For example, on macOS, when reduced motion is enabled in system preferences, it might be a good idea to respect that choice and use a media query to disable animations altogether. In fact, that's exactly what we do on the Connect page we analyzed earlier. The 3D animation on the cubes in the header is pretty subtle, but even that might be too much for some people. So if they choose to enable reduced motion in the accessibility pane, we respect that choice and reduce or even completely stop the animations on the page. All right, next one is about keeping animations fast. So again, animations can greatly improve the perception of the performance of your app, but it might as well do the exact opposite. Remember that the perception of speed is actually much more important than the actual performance. So let's make sure you are making things feel fast. Here, for example, which app is going to load first? Well, that's the right one for sure. And it seems obvious just because the loading spinner goes faster. And I know, it sounds really stupid, because at the end of the day, it's just a timing value I randomly picked in my code. But that alone changes the perception we might have on the performance of the app, even though there's obviously no relationship whatsoever between my animation duration and how long the app actually takes to load. So make sure you are focusing on how fast and snappy things look and feel in your interface, because that's what the end users remember. And last but not least, if you are using CSS animations, don't rely on the built-in easing curves, as the accelerations are not strong enough. And never ever use a linear timing function, as it's basically an insult to motion designers. Now, joking aside, if there's one thing that can make a bad animation look great and vice versa, it's the easing curve. You can actually find much nicer easing curves than the built-in keywords here. They are defined as CSS custom properties, so they are pretty much just as easy to use as the standard timing functions, and all your animations will basically look twice as nice just by switching to better easing curves. As an example, here's the header of the elements page we discussed earlier. And we have this nice morphing animation playing on the right, where we illustrate the customization and the types of payment forms you could have by using elements. And this animation feels really good and snappy and sort of lively and dynamic just because of the sharp easing curves being used. Now, as an example, let's see how the same animation would look without these nice easing curves. The animation still kind of works, but it feels a lot worse, and it completely lacks this energy that our custom easing functions were providing. So I can't stress enough the importance of literally designing your easing curves and not just picking one of the defaults, because that and the timing of your animation are the most crucial ingredients in proper motion design. Now, how do you choose between all these timing functions? What kind of curves should you use the most? Well, if you are not sure about the appropriate easing curve to use, it's probably safe to default on an ease-out timing function. And the reason for this is that, as we mentioned earlier, animations play a major role in how fast your interfaces feel. So, for instance, if you click on something and the dialog appears with an animation, you want to show that the event has immediately been triggered so that the interface feels very responsive. So most of the time, an ease-out curve, which can be represented like this, will be the best choice because the animation kicks off immediately, which gives the user a real-time feedback on the interactions. And that is a super important part of good UI design. Now, even though an ease-out timing function is by far the most common option, at least in UI design, the other easing types also have valid use cases. For example, an ease-in-out timing function, which accelerates and then decelerates, can be an appropriate choice when you are moving something that's already on the screen, because it is a compelling metaphor to how things move in real life, like a car, for example. For instance, the animation in the header of the billing page relies on an is-in-out timing function for every single part of the animation. And it makes a lot of sense here, because most of the elements move and scale, but they stay there all the time. So it's just about morphing and repositioning things on the screen. And for that use case, an is-in-out curve is a very good choice. Now, the is-in curves can be useful too, for example, when something is meant to disappear from the viewport. But in practice, its use cases are pretty unusual because the animation starts very slowly, which is typically something you want to avoid in your interface. As for linear animations, I would say you should avoid them in 99% of the cases. Basically, the only use case I can see where a linear animation might make sense is when you have this kind of ongoing animation where there are absolutely no interactions, and when the only thing that's happening is pretty much an automatic, constant scrolling of some content. So, aside from cases like this, don't use a linear timing function, because as we've seen previously with the elements header animation, you're not going to have this energy provided by the accelerations from the is-in and is-out curves. And you're going to end up with something that feels very unnatural. So, TLDR, kill linear animations with fire and use nice is-in curves. All right. So that's it for the design part. Now, for the development best practices, almost all of them are somehow related to performance. And the reason for this is that an animation must be performance in order to be convincing. Our eyes are extremely sensitive to that. So an animation that drops even a few frames here and there will look completely broken to us, and the illusion of the entire animation will basically be destroyed. And in fact, an animation running at a stable 30 FPS will look much better than a 60 FPS animation that's dropping frames from time to time. So the first tip is exactly about optimizing performance. In CSS, you can animate exclusively opacity and transform if you want to maximize your chances to reach a steady 60 FPS during your animation. Now, I realize it seems extremely limiting to only use opacity and transform for your animations, and you might be thinking that you won't be able to do much with these two properties. But in my experience, the vast majority of the effects we want to achieve can actually be done with just opacity and transform. So let's have a look at our favorite website, and specifically at the hover animation in the navigation bar. Now, this is the part where the organizers are taking a note to never invite me again. But it's a great example, anyway, of how the same effect can be achieved with better performance just by approaching things differently. All right. So here we can see that when we hover the navigation items, there's a small underline animation. Now, the first time I saw it, I thought it was cool, etc., but it didn't feel very smooth to me. So I went ahead and checked how it was done, and it turns out they are animating the border property. Now, it makes sense to use a border for that, because it is actually a border. So if anything, we should blame the browsers instead of the CSS developers. But given the fact that opacity and transform are the only things we can animate cheaply, let's recreate the same effects without using a border. So here, instead of using an actual border, I'm faking it with a pseudo element that I animate using transform. And as we can see, the animation now feels perfectly smooth. So that's just a very nitpicky example of how opacity and transform can be used for animating something that initially was supposed to be animated differently. And while here, it doesn't matter that much because it's just a very small thing happening quickly, it will look terrible if your animation is more prominent. So keep in mind that you can fake many effects with just opacity and transform, and the results you're going to have by using them are going to look significantly nicer. Now, even though you can be very creative with opacity and transform to achieve most animation needs, there are some valid cases where you really need to animate something else. And this is where SVG comes in handy. So if we take again the problem we just saw with the border animation, another way to approach this would be to rely on SVG instead of CSS. So this is an example of a CSS border animation on the left and the same kind of animation in SVG on the right. And as we can see, the SVG animation looks a lot smoother. But that's not because the CSS animation is dropping frames. It's only because the border increments by full pixels, which produce this kind of janky effect. Whereas in SVG, you get this nice sub-pixel interpolation. So even though these two animations perform the same way, they look radically different. That's another example, by the way, of how the actual performance doesn't really matter. What's important is how it feels. So keep in mind that SVG might be your friend when opacity and transform are not enough to produce the animations you want to do. Okay, next, embrace the Web Animations API. So if you are animating things in JavaScript, the Web Animations API will give you better performance than Request Animation Frame, mostly because Request Animation Frame runs on the main thread. So if you're trying to, say, animate a loading spinner, for example, the only way to keep the animation smooth during all the HTTP requests is to rely on the CSS engine, which the Web Animations API uses under the hood. So in terms of performance, the Web Animations API is on par with CSS animations, but I would encourage you to favor the Web Animations API over CSS, even if they perform the same way. And the reason for that is that coding your animations in JavaScript will give you a lot more freedom and will be a very good incentive to explore more creative options. So I personally rely on a lot of random parameters for my animations. For example, here on that icon we saw earlier, where the flame and the stars keep using a slightly different delay, duration, or position in order to create something that feels more natural. And this is something that you simply cannot do in CSS. So unless you are literally animating a tiny hover transition or whatever, you should probably default to the Web Animations API, because that's going to encourage you to create more interesting stuff. And even if you are not comfortable with JavaScript, you shouldn't be afraid of using the Web Animations API. It is significantly easier to use than Request Animation Frame. And in fact, it looks very similar to what you would do in CSS. So here's a quick comparison of a simple spinning animation done with CSS on the left, and the same one with the Web Animations API on the right. And as you can see, the code is pretty much the same. So really, there's no reason to avoid it, even if you are not super comfortable with JavaScript. All right, so the last one is about the infamous will change property. So the goal of this CSS property is to give some hints to the browser about the properties you're about to animate, so that the browser can apply the appropriate optimization ahead of time. And in practice, it often means promoting elements to their own layers in order to hopefully get better performance. Now, will change comes with a bunch of naughty side effects, like creating containing blocks, stacking context, consuming too much memory, etc. So my recommendation is that if you are not experiencing performance issues, just don't use it. And if you do have perf issues, make sure you understand how it works before using it. So we've just seen how to animate properly. And we mentioned during all the previous examples why we should animate things in the first place. So let's try to summarize the main reasons to bring animations to your interface. Let's start with the most important one, which is about connecting states. So we've seen how animations really help connecting the user behavior to what's happening on the screen and building a very clear relationship between the actions triggered by the user and the outcome in the interface. Next one is about keeping the user oriented. So animations are really good at sort of visually explaining where we are in the interface. For example, by sliding to the next section instead of just switching from state A to B without any kind of progress indication. The third one is about catching and guiding the user attention. For instance, to notify the user that the current state of the interface has changed, or because something important requires the focus of the user. Then the next one is about relying on animations to tell a better story, to communicate an idea and provide more context in a very effective way. For example, as we saw with the scroll-based 3D animation from the radar page. And last but not least, animations can greatly contribute to the perception of your product, as they can not only make everything significantly nicer to use, but they can also improve how fast and responsive your interfaces feel. All right, so that was a lot of complicated words to basically say that you should animate, but animate responsibly. Again, animations are incredibly useful, but all their benefits can easily backfire if you are misusing them. So make sure you are using animations the right way, and most importantly, make sure you are also having fun. Thank you very much.
Let's have a seat.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much. And from what I understood, you were actually invited after tweeting about the website.
Right, yeah.
So that's, I think, a good sign.
Yeah.
You're obviously a very hybrid. You're really on design and front end, both very, a lot of quality. Do you have any advice for people maybe in the audience that are on one or both sides, how they can maybe go into the other fields?
Yeah. Let me think. I would say that, code is definitely not a requirement for designers, and design is definitely not a requirement for developers. But we are in a very interesting, time where a lot of tools kind of merge, these professions together with things like, Framer and even just all the prototyping tools, even in Sketch, etc. And so, the distinction between these roles is becoming very blurry, and so I think it's still fine to specialize in something like an icon designer should definitely not know about web components, things like that. But like it's when you are doing things like web design, like I'm doing, or product design, etc. I think it really helps to know at least a little bit about the other roles, because, well, either you can do that by yourself, and that's great, or you just become way better at communicating with the other people because you understand, why this is actually hard or not hard, and so I think just in terms of collaboration, that is a net win, that's for sure.
A lot of the things you've done seem to be like hand-coded. Is that right, or are you using those tools that are available?
No, we don't use any tools. It's, I'm kind of a control freak, and so I really like to, ship only the bytes that I actually need and make sure everything is, runs properly. And so, it doesn't mean that all tools are terrible, etc. But like, I also just honestly enjoy the process of building these things by myself. So even if there's already like a library to like scroll to the next section, whatever, just the project of like figuring out how to do that, I find that personally fascinating. And so I'm not at all into the mindset of like, yeah, let's try to use all the tools so I don't have to do that. I'm like, yeah, I want to do that. That's, this is what makes me happy. So yeah.
You've also published quite a few on GitHub and libraries that people can use. Can you tell a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Well, since I usually code everything by myself from scratch, I tend to like build a lot of like small modules, etc. And so I just publish some of them. Like there's an animation library. There's a well, oddly enough, my most start GitHub repository is just for some front-end guidelines. So it's just a text document basically. I'm not sure that's a good thing or not, but yeah, I mean, I like to contribute to the design, and the community and industry, and try to share tools and ideas, because I think that's how we.
And something the designers here could use, I think, to improve their animation skills.
Yeah.
A lot of the questions on Twitter were based on accessibility things, and you already were answering some of those things. So, but still, there's feeling like does this improve accessibility, because you seem to be replacing like videos, images, all with code, and do you know if this improves accessibility?
Not by definition, no. I mean, you can make animations accessible, and you can make you can make videos accessible, and you can make animations not accessible at all, but like using the worst markup possible and doing crazy shit like that. And so it's honestly, I don't think there's anything evil in any of the web technologies. It honestly depends on how we use them.
Yeah, and this reducing of motion, which you were showing, because there were some questions about that. Yeah. Is this something that's broadly in all browsers or operating systems?
No, unfortunately, that's if I remember correctly, only in Safari for now. But it doesn't really matter. That's just an implementation detail. What I'm trying to convey is that you should care about that. Like you should pay attention to like your users, basically. That was just an example of doing that.
The things you're doing at Stripe are so attention grabbing. Also, I know it's a lot of people tweeted also like it's very well known. People know your design. So is it also a form of marketing that you're applying there, or should you say no? This is something you should always do.
To what? To like
to animate? This is all this quality and detail and animations.
I think the main reason is that we all like doing that, and we all like when products are just they feel nice, etc. Like it's something that's hard to kind of explain with like very rational reasons, etc. Because at the end of the day, you're just trying to create something that feels really good. But then it's also, I think, hard to not mention the fact that it does help a lot in marketing. Like when people see that, like see all the polish and the work and the care and the love you put into the marketing pages, they obviously think that, wow, if they put that much effort there, like obviously the rest of the products are going to be awesome too, right? And so it's kind of a side effect that we just like doing that, but I think it's a very nice side effect to have.
I also know from client work, it could be freaking with the whole team on all these details, and then the client will be, And what else did you finish?
Yeah, thankfully that's not a problem we really have. I think it's so we are a very design-focused company, and the founders, they really care about design and user experience, etc. That's absolutely not an afterthought. So I think that's really part of the culture, and I think that's something that's really hard to bring. Later in the process, if that's not something that you genuinely care about. It's not a one-time thing that you can. This is done. Design is good now. Let's check that in our to-do list. Now that should be part of the way you work, because otherwise that's completely useless.
Thank you very much for the answers and your
you.
talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you.